This is an unmitigated disaster. Kendrick Shaw's voice was cold steel, cutting through the tense silence of the war room. In the center of the table, a holographic display replayed the catastrophic failure of their prototype rocket engine, a billion-dollar dream disintegrating in a silent, fiery ballet. Dr. Evan Riley, the prodigy engineer, stammered, his eyes glued to the data streams. The simulations were flawless. This is impossible. The CEO, Julian Croft, slammed his palm on the table, the impact making the coffee cups jump. Your simulations are worthless, he roared, his face crimson with fury. He pointed a trembling finger at the terrified engineering team. Get me a real engineer. Someone who understands metal and fire, not just numbers on a screen. As the room reeled, Helena, the quiet secretary who had been refilling water glasses, placed her pitcher down with a soft click. She walked towards the hologram. Riley scoffed, Helena, we need a solution, not more coffee. She didn't even look at him. She simply raised a hand and pointed to a single, obscure bolt on the holographic schematic. In a clear, steady voice that silenced the room, she said, the harmonic resonance in the engine housing caused a shear stress fracture in this specific molybdenum bolt. The failure started here, exactly 6.2 seconds before detonation. Every arrogant, panicked man in the room froze, staring in stunned disbelief at the woman they never even saw. For a full 5 seconds, the war room was a vacuum. The collective shock of 20 high-powered men being corrected by a secretary sucked all the air out of the space. They stared at Helena, this quiet, unassuming woman in a sensible blouse, who had just spoken with more clarity and authority than anyone in the room. The first sound to break the spell was not a question, but a laugh. It was a short, sharp bark of disbelief from Dr. Evan Riley. Harmonic resonance, he chuckled, shaking his head as if clearing it of a ridiculous dream. He looked around at his team of junior engineers, sharing a look of condescending amusement. Helena, have you been reading the old engineering digests in the archives again? That's a fascinating theory, but I think we'll leave the science to the scientists. His tone was the one apparent uses for a child who has just tried to explain quantum physics using cartoon characters. It was patronizing, dismissive, and designed to put her back in her place. The CEO, Julian Croft, his face still a mask of crimson rage, found a new target for his fury. The interruption was an affront to his authority, a crack in the perfect, hierarchical world he commanded. Helena, what in God's name do you think you are doing? He snapped, his voice a low growl. I am trying to stop this company from bleeding out, and you're interrupting with nostalgic bedtime stories. This is not a debate club. Get back to your chair and take the minutes. To him, she was a functionary, a tool that was malfunctioning. The client, Kendrick Shaw, leaned back in his chair, a glacial look of contempt on his face. Croft, I must say, I'm not impressed, he said, his voice dangerously soft. Your lead engineer is clueless, and your secretary is offering opinions on metallurgy. Is this the premier aerospace firm you sold me on, or an amateur science fair? That jab was all Croft needed. He had to reassert control, and Helena was the perfect scapegoat. My sincerest apologies, Mr. Shaw, he said, turning a withering glare on Helena that made the junior engineers flinch. Helena is an excellent secretary. But she seems to have forgotten her role. He pointed a finger at her. Your job, Helena, is to ensure the coffee is hot and the minutes are accurate. Your job is not to play engineer. You will not speak again for the remainder of this meeting unless you are asked a direct question about the schedule. Am I making myself perfectly clear? The public dressing down was brutal, a verbal execution designed to remind everyone in the room of their place. Dr. Riley, seizing the opportunity to regain his footing and deflect from his own catastrophic failure, strode to the hologram. He smirked at Helena, the swagger returning to his posture. Let me illustrate for you, since you seem interested, he began, his voice dripping with condescension. The finite element analysis, which models every structural component under simulated stress, showed a maximum thermal structural load of less than 80% of the bolt's rated tolerance. There was no conceivable vector for a resonant cascade. He used the complex jargon like a weapon, each syllable designed to confuse and marginalize her. To punctuate his point, he swiped a hand through the holographic model. The single molybdenum bolt Helena had indicated vanished. There, Riley announced with a flourish. Problem solved. Now, if the real engineers can get back to work? He turned and, in a final act of utter contempt, held out his empty coffee mug to her. While you're up, Helena. Black, 2 sugars. Through it all, Helena's expression remained unreadable. There was no flush of shame, no flicker of anger, no hint of tears. Her composure was a quiet, infuriating shield that their insults couldn't penetrate. She simply looked at Croft, then at Riley, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Yes, Mr. Croft, she said, her voice as calm and steady as ever. She turned, walked back to the small side table that served as her station, and picked up his empty mug. The men in the room watched her, a wave of smug relief washing over them. The natural order had been restored. She took her seat and picked up her notepad. They assumed she was dutifully preparing to record their next brilliant, failing idea. But as she uncapped her pen, she wasn't writing down minutes. She was jotting down a complex differential equation, the very one that modeled the precise frequency and amplitude at which the molybdenum alloy would begin to shear. Riley, puffing his chest out, turned back to the screen. As I was saying before the interruption, he began, launching a new simulation. The most probable cause was a malfunction in the primary fuel injector, leading to an unstable burn. He began to weave a new narrative, a complex and technically plausible theory that had only one flaw. It was completely wrong. Kendrick Shaw was not impressed. He held up a hand, silencing Riley in an instant. I am not paying you for theories, Dr. Riley. I am paying for an engine that doesn't explode. He stood up, his towering presence commanding the room. You have 24 hours. I want a definitive cause and a viable, tested solution on my desk. If you fail, Astra Dynamics can consider our contract, and your future funding, terminated. He fixed his cold gaze on Riley. And I will personally see to it that you are unable to get a job designing a toaster, let alone a rocket engine, for the rest of your life. The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The clock was now ticking. As soon as Kendrick Shaw swept out of the room, Julian Croft turned on the engineering team like a cornered wolf. Nobody leaves this room, he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous command. Nobody eats, nobody sleeps, until you have an answer that will save this company. Am I understood? A sea of pale, terrified faces nodded back at him. The war room, once a symbol of innovation and power, had become a prison, a high-tech pressure cooker fueled by stale coffee and rising panic. The hours that followed were a slow-motion descent into chaos. Dr. Evan Riley, stripped of his usual arrogance, drove his team with a frantic, desperate energy. They ran simulation after simulation, each one a variation of his flawed fuel injector theory. Each one ended in a dead end, a digital ghost that offered no answers. The holographic engine exploded again and again, a monument to their repeated failure. With every failed run, Riley's temper frayed further. He lashed out at his junior engineers, his accusations growing more wild and irrational. Did you double-check the thermodynamic parameters? Are you sure you're inputting the data correctly? He'd snap, his voice tight with strain. This software is state-of-the-art. The only variable is human error, and I'm not the one making it. He was a captain sinking with his ship, blaming the crew for the iceberg he had steered them into. While this storm of impotent rage raged inside the war room, a quiet, methodical calm reigned just outside. At her desk in the darkened outer office, Helena Mendes was working. She was not answering phantom phone calls or organizing tomorrow's catering. She was typing with a steady, rhythmic focus, her eyes fixed on her screen. On it was not a Word document, but a complex CAD modeling program. She had, from memory, recreated the engine's schematics. With quiet precision, she was writing a full technical analysis of the structural failures she had identified. It was a masterpiece of engineering insight, complete with metallurgical stress calculations, fluid dynamics, and a detailed breakdown of the resonant frequencies. She was not just identifying the problem, she was solving it. A junior engineer, sent on a desperate coffee run, scurried past her desk, giving her a brief, pitying glance. He just saw the loyal secretary, forced to stay late because of their mess. The irony was a tangible thing in the silent office. At 3:17 a.m., the breaking point came. Their latest, most promising simulation crashed, the hologram freezing on an image of nonsensical, corrupted data. It was the final nail in the coffin of Riley's theory. He slumped into his chair, the fight gone out of him, replaced by the hollow, gray look of absolute defeat. Just then, the doors slid open and Croft entered, his face haggard from lack of sleep. "Report," he demanded. Riley couldn't even look at him. "Nothing," he mumbled. Nothing works. The simulations are inconclusive." "Inconclusive?" Croft's voice was dangerously quiet. "Riley, you have less than 3 hours to save this company, and you're telling me your $1 million computers have nothing?" In the tense silence, a young engineer near the back, a man named Ben who had been watching Helena with a flicker of curiosity earlier, cleared his throat. He was pale with fear, but spoke anyway. "Sir," he stammered, avoiding Riley's murderous glare. "What if, just to be thorough, we ran a simulation based on the secretary's theory? The harmonic resonance? Just to rule it out." Riley shot to his feet. "You want to waste our last precious hours chasing a secretary's fantasy?" he spat, his voice trembling with humiliated rage. "That is the most idiotic thing I have ever heard." But Croft, a man with absolutely nothing left to lose, latched onto the idea. Not because he believed it, but because it was a new target, a new direction for his fury. A cruel, spiteful idea began to form in his mind. He turned, a venomous smile spreading across his face. "You're right, Riley. It is idiotic. But then, my entire genius engineering department has proven to be idiotic. So let's embrace it." He spun around and stormed out of the war room, straight to Helena's desk. She looked up from her work, her calm expression unwavering. "You," Croft said, pointing a finger at her. "You think you're so much smarter than them. You think you have the answer?" He gestured back at the glass walls of the war room, where the entire team was now watching. "Fine. Prove it. I want a full diagnostic report, a material stress analysis, and a viable, costed-out engineering solution on my desk by 6 a.m. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a sadistic whisper, ensuring the humiliation would be total. "And you will do it in there. In front of them. So they can all watch the secretary play engineer." He straightened up. "If you are wrong, you will be escorted from this building and I will personally see to it that you never work in this city again." But if you're right, he couldn't even finish the sentence, the possibility was so alien to him. Helena looked at him. She looked past him, into the war room, at the sea of shocked, scornful, and terrified faces. She then looked down at the nearly completed report on her screen. Without a word, she saved the file, stood up, and picked up her notepad. She walked towards the war room. The glass doors slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, 20 engineers, including a horrified and utterly humiliated Dr. Riley, stared as she entered the lion's den. The impossible challenge had been accepted. The doors have just closed, and Helena is standing in a room full of the very men who publicly humiliated her. She has been given an impossible task, designed not for her to succeed, but to fail spectacularly. This moment is for every person who has ever had their ideas dismissed, for every quiet voice that has been talked over in a meeting. If you are ready to watch a lifetime of hidden genius wipe the smug smirks off a roomful of arrogant faces, then now is the time to join our community. Hit that subscribe button and get ready. You are not going to want to miss a single second of the masterclass that is about to begin. Let's watch this takedown together. The heavy glass doors of the war room slid shut behind Helena, sealing her in with the hostile, resentful engineering team. The air was thick with scorn. The young men, who hours before had been terrified for their jobs, now lounged in their chairs with renewed arrogance. They were no longer the ones on trial. She was. This was a welcome diversion, a chance to watch the uppity secretary get her comeuppance. Dr. Evan Riley, leaning against the main console with his arms crossed, gave her a lazy, insolent smirk. "Well, Helena, the stage is yours," he said, his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. "The grown-ups have failed. Dazzle us with your secretarial expertise. Shall we start by collating the data into a spreadsheet?" A few of his acolytes snickered. Helena didn't even glance at him. She walked with a calm, deliberate pace not to the coffee machine, but to the main holographic control console, the very spot Riley had just vacated. She placed her simple notepad on the surface next to a multi-million-dollar interface. She took a single, deep breath, and in that moment, a profound transformation occurred. The polite, deferential mask she had worn for 20 years simply fell away. The humble secretary vanished, and in her place stood Dr. Helena Mendes, a titan of her field who had been dormant for 2 decades. The change was in her posture, her eyes, her very presence. She now owned the room. Her first words were not directed to Croft, who watched from the doorway with a look of grim, sadistic curiosity, nor to the smirking Riley. She spoke to the room's integrated AI. Her voice was crisp, clear, and resonant with an authority that stunned the engineers into silence. "System," she commanded. "Run a Level 1 diagnostic on the materials stress testing module in the simulation software. I want to see the source code for version 3.1b. Display the primary subroutine for calculating harmonic resonance in non-ferrous alloys." The specificity of the command was like a slap in the face. This wasn't jargon she had overheard, this was the fluent language of a master. Riley's smirk faltered, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He knew that subroutine. It was the bedrock of their entire simulation platform, a piece of code so fundamental that no one had thought to question it in years. Thousands of lines of complex code instantly filled the main holographic screen. The junior engineers stared blankly, it was a language they were barely familiar with. But Helena's eyes scanned the data with the speed and precision of a supercomputer. Less than 10 seconds passed before she raised her hand and pointed. There. Her finger indicated a single, innocuous-looking line in the middle of a dense block of code. "That is your problem, Dr. Riley," she said, her voice devoid of any triumph, stating it as a simple, inarguable fact. "This is a standard equation for modeling molecular vibration under thermal stress. But this version of the code, which Astrodynamics has been using for 15 years, has a known rounding error. A flaw in the floating point calculation that only manifests at the 8th decimal place." She turned her gaze from the screen to Riley, whose face had begun to lose its color. "For 99% of standard applications, that error is statistically irrelevant. But you are not using a standard application. You are using a specialized molybdenum-titanium alloy, which has a unique crystalline structure. Under the specific kinetic and thermal pressures of a rocket engine at full burn, that tiny, infinitesimal rounding error doesn't just add up. It cascades. It multiplies exponentially until it creates a blind spot in the simulation. Your models weren't just wrong," she concluded, her voice cutting through the dead silence. "They were programmed to be blind to this exact type of catastrophic failure." The room was utterly still. Every engineer, every so-called genius, was frozen. Riley's face had turned the color of ash. He knew that line of code. He remembered seeing tiny, insignificant data anomalies in the output for months, dismissing them as sensor noise, as ghosts in the machine. A cold, sickening dread washed over him. It wasn't a ghost. It was a ticking time bomb, and he had been deaf to the sound. To prove her point, Helena didn't ask for permission or assistance. She sat down at the console, and her fingers, which they had only ever seen deliver coffee or type memos, flew across the holographic keyboard with a speed and confidence that was mesmerizing. She was not just a theorist, she was a creator. Code flowed from her fingertips as she wrote a small, elegant diagnostic patch to bypass the flawed subroutine. It took her less than 5 minutes. "Now," she said, standing up, her work done. "Run the final launch simulation again. With this patch." Looking like a man being led to his own execution, Riley numbly stumbled forward and initiated the sequence. The entire room, including Croft in the doorway, held its breath. The simulation began, the clock counting down. The holographic engine ignited. For the first few seconds, everything looked identical to their previous failed runs. Green lights across the board. Then, it happened. A new data stream appeared, a terrifying spike in vibrational energy originating from deep within the engine's core. On the 3D model, a thin, almost invisible red line of stress appeared, exactly on the molybdenum bolt she had pointed to hours earlier. The line intensified, turning from red to a searing white. Then, at exactly 6.2 seconds into the burn, the bolt on the hologram flashed with a catastrophic failure warning and shattered into 1,000 pieces. She was right. Down to the 10th of a second. She was absolutely, devastatingly, and miraculously right. The simulation ended, but the final, damning image of the shattered bolt remained, projected in the holographic glow. It hung in the center of the war room like a verdict. The silence that followed was absolute, a profound quiet born not of tension, but of pure, unadulterated awe. The smirks had vanished from the faces of the junior engineers, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. In the doorway, Julian Croft's jaw hung open, his mind struggling to reconcile the image of his quiet, efficient secretary with the engineering genius who had just dissected his company's massive failure with the precision of a master surgeon. Dr. Evan Riley stood frozen, looking at the screen, then at Helena, then back at the screen. The color had drained from his face, leaving a sickly, pale sheen of sweat on his brow. He had been proven wrong not just in his conclusion, but in his fundamental understanding of the very science he professed to command. Helena did not bask in the silence. She did not wait for an apology or acknowledgement. The clock was still ticking towards Croft's 6 a.m. deadline. "The problem has been identified," she announced, her voice crisp and authoritative, pulling the room of stunned men from their stupor. "Now, we design the solution." She walked towards the large, pristine whiteboard that covered the far wall, a space usually reserved for Riley's self-important diagrams. As she approached, the engineers, including a shell-shocked Riley, instinctively parted for her, shuffling out of her way. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. She was no longer an intruder. She was the commander, and they were her bewildered troops. She picked up a black marker, uncapped it, and began to draw. Her hand moved with a speed and certainty that was mesmerizing. There were no hesitant strokes, no pauses to reconsider. A new design for the engine's mounting bracket flowed from the marker onto the board, a perfect, elegant structure of sweeping lines and complex angles. She filled the space around the drawing with a dizzying array of calculations: tensile strength, shear stress coefficients, thermal expansion rates, fluid dynamic pressures. It was a symphony of higher mathematics and applied physics, performed flawlessly and from memory. After several minutes, she stepped back, revealing a complete, detailed blueprint. She turned to face her stunned audience. "A simple reinforced bolt or a thicker bracket will not solve the problem," she stated, her tone now that of a seasoned professor addressing a class of freshmen. "The resonant frequency will still exist, and a stronger component will simply fail more spectacularly. We don't need to fight the vibration, we need to nullify it." She tapped a section of her drawing. "We will replace the solid bracket with a new, laminated composite design. We will alternate microthin layers of the existing titanium alloy with a viscoelastic polymer. The polymer layers will act as a non-Newtonian dampener. They will absorb the harmonic vibrations as they pass through the material and convert that kinetic energy into negligible amounts of heat, which will dissipate through these heat sinks." She pointed to another part of her design. "We don't just stop the shaking. We make the shaking disappear." The solution was breathtaking in its elegance and simplicity. It was a concept from a different level of thinking, a beautiful, innovative answer to a brutal problem. Croft, finally finding his voice, turned on his lead engineer. "Riley? Is she right? Is this possible?" Riley stared at the whiteboard, his prodigy brain finally comprehending the sheer genius of her design. To deny it would be to deny the laws of physics themselves. The admission was the most difficult thing he had ever had to do, a public dismantling of his entire ego. Yes, he stammered, the word barely a whisper. Theoretically, it's brilliant. Croft, however, was a pragmatist. His mind had already jumped to the next hurdle. Brilliant? It's impossible, he barked, a hint of his old bluster returning. It would take a specialty lab 6 months to design and fabricate a custom composite like that. We have 2 hours until sunrise. Helena was unfazed. She turned from the whiteboard and walked back to the main console. We won't fabricate it, she said calmly. We will repurpose it. She pulled up a new file on the holographic display, an archival schematic so old the junior engineers didn't even recognize the project name. The landing gear assembly for the Odyssey deep space probe, a project Astrodynamics scrapped 3 years ago. The primary shock absorbers were constructed from a near-identical polymer laminated composite to withstand atmospheric entry stress. She zoomed in on a detailed inventory manifest. According to this, there are 12 spare units, item number 77B4, sitting in crates in warehouse 7B. I filed the disposal deferment paperwork myself. She looked up at the room of stunned faces. A technician with a plasma cutter can modify the component to our specifications in under an hour. We can have a working prototype ready for a test simulation before your deadline, Mr. Croft. The room was silent once more. She hadn't just solved the billion-dollar engineering problem. She had solved the manufacturing, supply chain, and timeline crisis in the same breath, using her encyclopedic knowledge of the company's own forgotten history. It was a checkmate so total, so absolute, that all the men in the room could do was stare in utter, humbled silence. The revelation hung in the air for a moment longer, a testament to a mind that saw not just the problem, but the entire universe in which it existed. Then, Julian Croft, the CEO, took a step forward. The arrogant, blustering man was gone, replaced by someone humbled and awestruck. He looked at Helena not as his secretary, but as his last and only hope. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet and laced with a respect she had never heard from him. What do you need, Dr. Mendes? The use of her proper title was a white flag, a total surrender. Helena didn't waste a second on triumph. She became a field marshal deploying her forces. Ben, she said, her voice sharp and clear, turning to the young engineer who had first dared to voice her theory. He straightened up, his eyes wide. Get a team of 2 and go to warehouse 7B. You'll need a plasma cutter with a diamond bit. These are the schematics for the modification. She airdropped the file to his tablet. I want that component here in 90 minutes. Ben simply nodded, a look of fierce loyalty on his face, and sprinted from the room. You too, she said, pointing to the lead software engineers. Recalibrate the physical testbed software to account for the new component's material density. I want it ready to run a full-stress simulation the moment that part arrives. They scrambled to their workstations without a word. The entire room was now hers, a well-oiled machine responding to her command. Dr. Evan Riley, the fallen prodigy, was left standing alone in the center of the room, a man without a purpose. Helena walked over to him. She didn't mock him or gloat. She offered him a lifeline, a chance to be a part of the solution, but on her terms. She handed him her simple notepad, the one filled with her elegant, handwritten equations. Dr. Riley, she said, her voice even and professional. I need a second set of eyes on my thermal dissipation coefficients. Please verify my math. It was the ultimate, professionally devastating act. She was asking him, the lead engineer, to check her homework. His hands trembled as he took the notepad. He looked down at the page, and his breath caught in his chest. The math was not just correct, it was art. It was a fluid, intuitive, masterful series of calculations that were more elegant than anything he had ever produced. In that moment, staring at her handwriting, Evan Riley was truly and utterly humbled. He nodded, unable to speak, and went to a corner to begin his work, a subordinate for the first time in his life. The next 90 minutes were a blur of focused, purposeful energy. Helena moved between the teams, a comm center in the whirlwind she had created. She answered complex coding questions from the software team, offered a suggestion to Ben's fabrication crew over the comms that shaved 10 minutes off their work, and guided the entire process with the effortless grace of a grandmaster playing on a dozen chessboards at once. She was not just a genius, she was a leader. Finally, Ben's team returned, bearing the newly forged component like a holy relic. It was installed in the physical test bed, and the final simulation was prepped. The entire team, exhausted but electric with anticipation, gathered around the main console. Croft stood at the back, his face a mask of awe and shame. Helena stood at the front, her hand hovering over the console. She looked at Croft, who gave a single, deferential nod. It was her moment. She initiated the test. The holographic engine roared to life. The simulation clock ticked past 1 second, then 2. The energy output climbed. It reached the critical 6.2-second mark. The moment of catastrophic failure. And nothing happened. On the diagnostic screen, they all saw it. The vibrational energy spiked, just as before, but as it hit the new composite bracket, it was absorbed, canceled out, the angry red lines of the stress monitor smoothed into calm, gentle waves of green. The energy dissipated harmlessly, exactly as her equations had predicted. The simulation continued, reaching 100% thrust, then 110%. It was a flawless, beautiful, spectacular success. A beat of stunned silence, and then the room erupted. It was a primal cheer of exhausted, ecstatic relief. The engineers were clapping, shouting, some hugging each other. But their applause, their cheers, were all directed at one person. They were for Helena. Croft was the first to approach her, his face pale. Helena. Dr. Mendes, he stammered, his voice thick. I have no words. What I said to you, how I treated you, it was inexcusable. Abusive. From the bottom of my heart, I am truly sorry. Riley came next, his eyes red-rimmed. He couldn't meet her gaze, staring at the floor instead. Dr. Mendes, he said, his voice cracking. That was the most brilliant piece of engineering I have ever witnessed. My behavior, my arrogance, there is no excuse for it. You have my unending professional respect. Helena looked at these two powerful, broken men. She listened to their apologies. She did not smile. She did not say, I told you so. Her victory was too absolute for such petty confirmations. She simply looked at them, her calm, steady gaze holding them in place, and gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. In the silent, ringing aftermath of the storm, that was all that needed to be said. The exhausted, euphoric cheers of the engineering team echoed in the war room, a sound of pure, cathartic release. It was Ben, the young engineer who had shown her the first glimmer of respect, who approached her first, his eyes shining with an almost religious reverence. Dr. Mendes, he said, his voice full of awe. I've never seen anything like that. That was legendary. The other engineers, who hours ago had been snickering at her, now murmured in fervent agreement, nodding their heads. In the span of a single night, she had transformed in their eyes from a piece of office furniture into a titan. Helena's victory was so complete that she had no need for triumphalism. She simply gave them a small, tired, but genuine smile. Thank you, all of you, she said, her voice calm and professional. It was a team effort to get it done on time. Now, let's get this report cleaned up and formally presented to Mr. Shaw. The work isn't over yet. Her focus, even now, was on the task, on seeing the job through to its proper conclusion. She hadn't done it for the glory, she had done it because the problem needed to be solved, and she was the one who could solve it. Her humility in the face of their adoration was, perhaps, the most powerful lesson of all. At precisely 6 a.m., Kendrick Shaw swept back into the war room, his face a grim mask of expectation. He was ready to sever the contract and bury the company. Instead, he was met by a scene of quiet, exhausted order. Julian Croft stood waiting for him, holding a single, elegantly prepared data tablet. But when Croft began to speak, it was not with the excuses Shaw had expected. Mr. Shaw, Croft began, his voice clear and steady, devoid of its usual bluster. We have found the definitive cause of the failure, and we have engineered a viable, tested, and immediately implementable solution. He paused, then did the one thing no one in the room expected. He turned and gestured to Helena. But I need to be perfectly clear. My team did not achieve this. I did not achieve this. This company was saved tonight by one person, Dr. Helena Mendes. In front of the client and the entire engineering staff, Croft recounted the events of the night with brutal, unflinching honesty. He described Helena's initial insight, his own arrogant dismissal, Dr. Riley's condescending mockery, and the impossible challenge he had issued out of spite. He detailed her methodical brilliance, her calm leadership, and the genius solution that she alone had envisioned. It was a complete and total confession, a public act of self-immolation that was also, strangely, the most respectable thing any of them had ever seen him do. His karmic justice was not a firing, it was a forced, painful, and ultimately redeeming rebirth. He had been humbled to his very core, forced to see that the true value in his company lay not in the swagger of his star engineers, but in the quiet, overlooked brilliance of the woman he had treated like a servant. Shaw listened to the entire story without interruption, his expression unreadable. When Croft was finished, a long silence filled the room. Then, the client looked at Riley, whose face was ashen with shame. Shaw's justice for him was swift and perfectly tailored. Dr. Riley, Shaw said, his voice cold as ice. Your arrogance nearly cost me $1 billion and cost this company its future. A man like you needs to learn that genius without humility is a liability. He then looked at Helena. Dr. Mendes, I will only continue to fund this project on one condition, that you are given full oversight. Effective immediately. He turned back to a horrified Riley. Your new title is Junior Engineer. Your new boss is Dr. Mendes. You will report directly to her, and you will learn from her. Perhaps one day, you'll be a real engineer. Dismissed. Finally, all eyes were on Helena. Croft, a changed man, immediately ratified Shaw's condition. Dr. Mendes, he said, I am creating a new position for you, effective immediately, Chief of Diagnostic Engineering. You will have authority over every project this company undertakes, and you will report directly to me. He handed her the data tablet. What is your first order of business? Helena took the tablet, the symbol of her new, hard-won authority. She looked at the humbled faces of the men who had scorned her. She looked at Croft, her new ally, and Riley, her new subordinate. There was no trace of triumph in her eyes, only a quiet, resolute purpose. My first order of business, she said, her voice calm and steady, is to conduct a full review of the source code for every active project in this company. The era of blind spots is over. It was a quiet declaration of a new age at Astrodynamics. The old boys' club hadn't been overthrown with a loud revolution. It had been dismantled by quiet, undeniable, and long overdue competence. A month later, Astrodynamics was a company reborn. The palpable atmosphere of fear and ego had been replaced by a quiet, collaborative hum of productivity. The war room, once a theater for tyrannical tantrums, was now an open-door hub of innovation. At its center was Dr. Helena Mendes. She had declined the large corner office offered to her, opting instead for a modest, functional workspace with a glass wall overlooking the main engineering floor. Her door was never closed. Junior engineers, once terrified of asking stupid questions, now flocked to her, and she would patiently sketch out complex theories for them on her whiteboard. Evan Riley was a shadow of his former self, but in the best possible way. The arrogance had been burned out of him, replaced by a quiet, cautious humility. He was often the first to arrive and the last to leave. One afternoon, he brought a report to Helena, his hands trembling slightly. Dr. Mendes, he said, his voice low. I think I've found a potential flaw in my own stress calculations for the new fuel pump. I've flagged it here. A month ago, he would have buried the mistake. Now, he was exposing it. Helena reviewed the data, nodded, and instead of criticizing him, she said, Good catch, Evan. That shows integrity. Let's work through the solution together. It was the first time she had used his first name. It was a small gesture, but for Riley, it was a monumental step on the long road to becoming the kind of engineer Helena was. The story of the secretary who saved the spaceship became a legend in the tech world. Helena was inundated with offers and awards. The most prestigious was the Katherine Johnson Award for Innovation in Engineering, a prize she was not only awarded, but for which she was the inaugural recipient. It was the ultimate vindication, a recognition of her genius on a global scale. Julian Croft was ecstatic, planning a massive press conference and a gala in her honor. But the night before the announcement, Helena sat in her small, comfortable apartment. The official, embossed invitation lay on her coffee table next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. It was everything she had been denied 20 years ago, the recognition, the prestige, the seat at the table. But as she looked around her quiet home, at the shelves overflowing with books, at the small, thriving herb garden on her balcony, she felt a profound sense of peace. She was already whole. Her phone rang. It was Croft, buzzing with excitement. Helena. I'm looking at the press release. From secretary to savior. It's perfect. We'll have you on the cover of every major tech journal in the world. This is your moment. Helena smiled softly. Julian, she said, her voice warm. I am deeply honored by the award. But please, cancel the press conference. No gala. Croft was stunned into silence for a moment. What? Helena, why? This is your victory lap. You've earned it. I earned the right to do the work, Julian, she replied. The rest is just noise. Those 20 years I spent as a secretary, I don't see them as lost time. Engineering taught me how things break. Being a secretary taught me how companies break. It taught me to listen, to observe, and to understand that the person with the loudest voice isn't always the one with the best idea. She paused. I'm an engineer. I solve problems. The title, the awards, they are wonderful, but they don't change the work. For me, the work has always been the reward. The story of Helena Mendes doesn't end with her on a glittering stage, accepting a trophy. It ends on a quiet Tuesday night, months later. She's in the war room, a cup of herbal tea steaming beside her, leaning over a holographic display with Ben, patiently explaining a complex fluid dynamics problem. Evan Riley is there too, working at a nearby console, a quiet and now essential part of the team. Croft pokes his head in around 10 p.m., not to check up on them, but to ask if they need a fresh pot of coffee. Helena looks up from the glowing schematic, surrounded by her team, by the quiet hum of minds working together to solve a puzzle. And on her face is a small, deeply content smile. She had not just reclaimed a career. She had built a new and better world for herself, one defined not by the world's applause, but by the quiet, profound satisfaction of a problem, finally, beautifully, solved. Helena's story is a stunning reminder that the most brilliant mind in the room is often the quietest. It's a tribute to all the people who do the work, not for the credit, but for the sake of the work itself. Their genius is hidden in plain sight, waiting for a chance to shine. Now, we want to hear about the hidden genius in your life. Who is that person you know? The quiet IT guy who can solve any problem, the school janitor who knows every student's name, the administrator who is the true heart of the office. Go to the comments and tell us their story. Let's create a tribute to the overlooked experts who truly hold our world together. If you believe in celebrating quiet competence over loud arrogance, make sure you hit that follow button and join us for the next story.